Operations with rational numbers, Chapter 2, Lesson 5, Part 1. Rational numbers are numbers that can be in M and N or fraction form. And the rules for adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing negative rational numbers are the same as for negative integers. So you just need to follow the same steps. But remember, when dealing with fractions, with adding and subtracting, we have to have common denominators. So adding rational numbers. We have an example here, negative 2/3 plus a negative 1/5. So negative 2/3 plus negative 1/5, before we can do anything, we need to have a common denominator. They already figured out for you that the least common denominator is going to be negative 15. So they did 3 times negative 5 to get that as negative 15. And then they also multiplied the top times negative 5. And then in the second fraction as 1/5, they multiplied by a positive 3 on both the top and the bottom. So we have 10/15, and it's negative 10/15 plus a negative 3/15. So remember, when we're adding a negative plus a negative, we can just add here because it's negative plus a negative. Okay, so 10 plus 3 will give us our numerator, which is 13 over negative 15. And then when you write it as an equivalent fraction, the negative is in front of the whole fraction, like they have here, not at the top or the bottom. If we have a negative sign at the top or the bottom, the whole fraction is negative. Okay, so when we are adding rational numbers that are in mixed number form, I want you to separate out your fraction into the whole numbers. So 1 and 2/3, we separated it as 1 plus 2/3. And in negative 2 and 1/4, we separated it to negative 2 plus a negative 1/4. It's important that you realize that in negative 2 and 1/4, everything in that is negative, the whole number and the fraction. So then group your whole numbers together, 1 plus a negative 2, and group your fractions together, 2/3 plus a negative 1/4. You can do this operation right away. 1 plus negative 2 is where this negative 1 comes from. And before you can add 2/3 plus 1/4, you have to make it have a common denominator, which they already told you the least common multiple is 12. So they did the conversions for you. So now we have negative 8 plus 8/12 plus a negative 3/12. So 8/12 plus a negative 3/12 is where they got the 5/12 from. And now we need to combine negative 1 plus a 5/12. We can't just put negative 1 and 5/12 because they're not both negative. So negative 1, they changed it to a fraction as negative 12 over 12, because 12 divided by 12 equals 1. So they chose a denominator that's the same as the fraction we already have in place. So now they added a negative 12/12 plus a positive 5/12. So remember, now when we add or subtract fractions, we're just dealing with the numerators. So we applied the rules that when we are working with a negative and a positive, we're going to subtract the absolute values. So negative 12 minus the absolute value of negative 12 is 12, minus 5 is 7, and we keep the sign of the larger digit, so 12 is larger than 5. So that's why we have a negative 7/12 here in our answer. Okay, so now we have another example here where you are asked to add 3 rational numbers. So in this case, you have 2/3 plus a negative 5/8 plus 1/6. So there's nothing different here except that we have 3 fractions. So it's important that you change all the fractions to have a common denominator. So in this case, you'd have to find the least common multiple of 3, 8, and 6. And they did that already for you and figured out that it's 24. So in this part right here, they did the math to multiply to get everything to have a denominator of 24. So now we just do 16 plus a negative 15 plus 4. And again, we're keeping our denominator 24, so we can do all of those 3 steps together. So 16 plus a negative 15 really becomes the absolute value of 16 minus the absolute value of negative 15, which is simply 1. And it's going to stay a positive 1 because 16 is larger than 15. And then we add 4. And that's where we get our numerator of 5/24. Or a numerator of 5, and the denominator again is staying 24. All right, so let's do some practice. In number 1, we have negative 1 1/2 plus 2 3/8. So before we can do anything with fractions, remember we need to make common denominators. So I know that the least common multiple of 2 and 8 is going to stay 8. So I need to do some math here. 1 times 4 and 2 times 4. And then 3/8 is already a denominator of 8, so there's no need to change. So 1 times 4 is 4, and 2 times 4 is 8. So now I have a negative 4/8 here. Again, it's negative because this whole fraction is negative, plus a positive 3/8. So first I'm going to add my whole numbers. Negative 1 plus 2 is just a positive 1. And then a negative 4/8 plus a negative 3, or plus a positive 3/8 is a negative 1/8. So 1 plus a negative 1/8, I need to convert 1 into 8/8 plus a negative 1/8 here to get my actual answer. Because again, I can't just add a positive 1 to a negative 1/8 and put a negative 1 1/8. That wouldn't be true. So I have 8/8 plus a negative 1/8, which is actually going to leave me with the answer of 7/8 here. So let's do number 2. 1/4 plus a negative 5/12 plus a negative 2/3. Well, the least common denominator in this case is 12. So I'm going to do my conversions. 1/4 equals something over 12. So I'm multiplying by 3. So 3/12 plus a negative 5/12. That one doesn't need to change. And then negative 2/3 equals something over 12. So I'm multiplying by 4. So a negative 8/12. All right, so now I'm first going to combine my negatives here. And negative 5/12 plus negative 8/12, I'm going to get negative 13/12. And then 3/12 plus that. So now I have 3 plus a negative 13 all over 12. Remember, when adding a negative and a positive, I subtract the absolute values. So the absolute value of negative 13 minus the absolute value of 3 equals 10. And it's going to be negative because my negative number was larger, 13. So I have negative 10/12. So that's what will go here, negative 10/12. And that's not in simplest form, so I would need to divide by the greatest common factor of 10 and 12, which in this case, I'm just going to write it over here so you have more room. Negative 10/12 in this case is going to be 2. So 10 divided by 2. Negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5. And 12 divided by 2 is 6. So I have negative 5/6 as my final answer. Okay, let's do some more practice. In number 3, there's negative 3/4 plus a negative 1/5. So again, my first step is to make common denominators. So I know the least common multiple of 4 and 5 is going to be 20. So negative 3/4 equals what over 20? I'm multiplying by 5, so that's negative 15 twentieths. And 1 negative 1/5 equals what over 20? I'm multiplying by 4. So I would get a negative 4 twentieths. So now I have negative 15 twentieths plus negative 4 twentieths. Because they're both negatives, I can just add, and my answer will be negative 19 twentieths. All right, number 4, we have mixed numbers, negative 1 1/3 and 2 5/6. So before anything, I want to change to common denominators. And I see right away that the common denominator is going to be 6. So 1/3 equals 2/6. So now I have negative 1 and 2/6 plus 2 5/6. So first I'm going to group my whole numbers, negative 1 plus 2 plus negative 2/6 plus 5/6. So I'm going to do the adding of my whole numbers and then my fractions. Negative 1 plus 2 is a positive 1. And positive 1, not 11. And negative 2/6 plus 5/6 is a positive 3/6. So because both of these are positive, I can just stick them together. So that would be positive 1 and 3/6. And I think you all know that you can simplify 3/6 back down to 1/2. So your answer is 1 and 1/2. Okay, number 5 and 6, we have 3 fractions added together. Again, nothing's changed except you need to make a common denominator for all 3. So 3, 6, and 4. So I'm using my basic multiplication facts here to realize that the least common multiple is 12. So 1/3 equals 4/12. Negative 5/6 will equal negative 10/12. And then negative 3/4 will equal negative 9/12. Now we have a new problem. 4/12 plus a negative 10/12 plus a negative 9/12. First, I'm going to group my two negatives together because those are easy just to add. So now I have negative 19/12 here. And I still have to add on my 4/12. So now I'm going to subtract the absolute values of the numerator. So the absolute value of negative 19 minus the absolute value of 4 would be 15. And that's going to remain negative because 19 is here. So this equals negative 15 over 12. I would never leave it that way. I would do long division. Long division to get that into a mixed number. 12 goes into 15 one time. I subtract. I get 1 remainder 3. So I would have 1, negative 1, and 3/12, which I can simplify that even more. And I would have negative 1 and 1/4. Again, it's a lot of little steps, but it's all stuff you have done before. Okay, why don't you give 2/3 plus negative 3/8 minus 1/4 try and come back and check your answer in just a moment. So 2/3 plus negative 3/8 minus 1/4. The least common multiple of 3, 8, and 4 is going to be 24. So 2/3 equals what over 24? We multiply by 8. So 16. Negative 3/8 equals what over 24? So I'm multiplying by 3. So that's negative 9. And 1/4, we have to multiply by 6. So that's going to be 6/24. So don't forget here that when we do subtraction, we actually want to add the opposite. So we're going to add the negative 1/4 in this case, or what we transferred to negative 6/24. So now we have 16/24 plus negative 9/24 plus a negative 6/24. So again, I'm going to combine these first. Negative 9 plus negative 6 is negative 15/24 plus 16/24. Sorry, plus, not equals. And that, when we add those together, is going to be just 1/24. That's the final answer you should have gotten there. So that's it for adding rational numbers. Again, feel free to go back and use your notes from 7.2.1 or 2, I believe it was, so that you can review the steps for how to add and subtract negatives, because you'll be applying those same rules when it comes to fractions. Just make sure when adding and subtracting fractions, you have common denominators.